which I think is perfectly good wine tasting, potentially, if that's what the wine tastes like. And he wants to actually replace this by chemical formulae and say that it will be just as good, that we can say that what that means chemically is this or that. This is the worst kind of reduction there is. I suppose he probably thinks you can do that with literary criticism as well, right? That you can replace perhaps a good Shakespeare criticism with a brain scan of the reader as they're reading Shakespeare or something, right? To show which neural activation patterns are being activated by certain Shakespeare plays. I think this would be ridiculous. So that's the sense of critique that I want to defend. Now I want to get to the conclusion here. How can, if I'm saying that in an artwork, the sensual qualities, the qualities of an artwork are obviously visible, I'm saying they fuse with a real object. How can they do that, given that the real object is always absent? The real object is never present. It's always eluding us. So how can this happen? Well, where does the reality principle come from, in other words, if the reality principle is always absent? My answer is that the reality principle is not absent. The reality principle is you. You, the spectator. You, the spectator, are a real object. Somehow, your relation to the sensual qualities must be transformed in such a way that you do become part of the artwork. The artwork is constructed. The artwork is not an attempt to approach the real thing outside the mind. This is impossible. What you can do is you can produce a hybrid entity in which you and the qualities of the artwork are somehow combined. And I thought of this when I was reading Levi's thing about the machines and his critique of mimesis. There's another sense of mimesis than the usual one, though. Usually mimesis, in the conservative sense that everyone hates, is taken to mean you're making a copy of something, right? You're making a painting of something, or you're making a drawing of something. But there's another sense of mimesis, which is that you yourself are imitating the thing. Method acting, right? You know, you're a tree. What's your motivation? You're becoming the tree, in a sense. You're becoming united with the qualities of the tree. So I'll end on this note, but there are a couple of implications of this that I want to highlight. And this is a fairly new idea for me. This has just occurred to me in the last few months as a way of solving the problem of how to get at the withdrawn art object. It helps legitimate those theories of art that talk about the viewer or reader response. The object, in other words, the art object is not the object apart from me, but the art object of which I myself am half. It's a new object. I should have added that for object-oriented philosophy, all relations form a new object. All relations form a new object. Why? Because an object does not mean an autonomous physical piece, as opposed to something that's made of two pieces physically. An object means something that has a unified reality that no one can exhaust from the outside. And if you're in relation to a person, for example, let's say you're in a marriage, to take a very extreme example, that marriage has an autonomous reality that has an effect on both of the people in it. It's not just the combination of the two people. It has a certain weight with the two people in it. It's somewhat opaque to the people outside it. It's somewhat opaque to the people inside it. It has a certain reality that cannot be exhausted by any of the participants or any of the observers of the marriage. And the same holds for any relation. Put two things together. You put two hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom together to get water. The water has a reality that exceeds any direct interaction of the hydrogen and the oxygen or any use that's made of the water by someone outside of it. So the art object is not an object outside of the viewer, but is one made from a combination of the viewer and what we call the object. This also would justify what is often critically called the theatrical approach to art in Michael Fried's famous essay, where he criticizes minimalism for a theatrical approach, for the fact that the viewer always has to be inscribed into the artwork. And for Fried, who's one of the most famous continuers of Clement Greenberg's art criticism, which I admire more than most people, sees this as a negative. The idea of the artwork is theatrical. It follows from my conception that the artwork has to be theatrical. You have to participate. You have to be sincerely involved in the artwork, or it's not an artwork. And finally, this would call into question Kant's notion of the artwork as something we experience with disinterest, something we experience without any personal interest, because we would precisely have to become involved with it. We would have to become worked up by it and involved in the artwork. So I will stop there and take any questions you have.
Is this okay? Okay, so we're going to open the floor to questions. I imagine there are, seeing as certainly in the way that I've understood the paper that you gave, there are relationships between what you said and what we were working through and over the week. especially the last sort of maybe 10 minutes about the artwork. But first of all, we'll open the floor. Has anyone got any questions? Zhao? That's a half question over there.
Yes?
Yeah.
Sure.
And then afterwards, Levi.
I just want to clarify the point towards towards the end of your talk. So would you be saying that, for instance, that there would be as many, Picasso's Guernicas as relations that between people or between a viewer and the painting?
It's an interesting implication. I hadn't thought of it that way. What I would say is that there's obviously a unity to the Picasso, but when we're talking about the unity to the Guernica, we're talking about the unity of that physical thing, organized in a certain way. But the artwork is not an artwork unless it's being reactualized. I think that would be a mistake to say that. And so when it's reactualized, yes, in each sense, each experience of it is a new art event. I see the problem you're pointing to, though. How would you talk about the unity of a given artwork? And I think the unity of that would be found in the object itself, the paint and the canvas. But that it only becomes actualized when the person is there and a new object is formed out of that encounter. And one piece of evidence for that is that Guernica isn't really Guernica if a 3-year-old walks in front of it, right? If that child who was disturbing us walks past Guernica, it's not really going to be an artwork. It's going to be a potential artwork. If all humans are exterminated, in a sense, Guernica is exterminated as well. I mean, the paint and the canvas are there. Maybe an alien species can come experience it later, but it's not really an artwork unless it's being experienced, is one I would say. So you're not making an object, you're making an experience. You're making an object that can generate future experiences for other people.
I think that's something we might like to return to, but I definitely want to take Levi's question point first.
Causation,
Right.
and how it works. So if we, I'm just trying to visualize it, right? So because that's what I've never been able to visualize. Because the way I think about it when I hear you talk about it as a central object being an object that exists on the interior of another object, I don't see how the relation is being formed. So, I mean, am I diagramming it correctly? We have a black marker. Okay, so say this is a real object. Yeah, sure. This is a real object, so this is a cat, right? And over here, we have another real object, the litter box of the cat, right? And so our whole question, since both of these are withdrawn from each other, how are they relating to one another? And where is the central object? The cat is relating to the litter box in some way. Is the central litter box inside the cat?
No.
Or is it over here?
It's in between. The two have to be in some kind of relation for the central object to exist. Things have to be in relation before they can enter into relation, paradoxically. They have to be in relation so that the cat can perceive that litter box and come into closer or different relation to it. But before I get more into that, how are you going to get around the problem of vicarious causation? Given that you accept that there's translation, how can you start off with something that's other than translation? How can you say that direct relation is not a problem?
I'm just not sure what this is at all.
Essential object?
Yeah, essential object, if you're placing it in the middle between them, because then it seems to be like a real physical material thing to me that's out there in the world.
No, it's not between them. It's on the interior of the larger object formed by the two real objects. In other words,
So there's a third object.
there's a third object that somehow...
It's formed when they come into relation with one another.
That's right. The cat and the litter box have to be in relation in some way, obviously, because one is perceiving the other. Actually, both are perceiving each other, probably. And so there has to be a larger unit that contains them both, and the central object is, along with the real cats, are contained on the interior of that larger object.
Okay.
It has to be that way.
Yeah, I mean, in my model, I just have two real objects. This one perturbs it in some way, and the translation that takes place, right, is a distortion or a caricature of the perturbation.
Okay, well, when it perturbs, what is it perturbing? Is it perturbing a caricature, or is it perturbing the real thing? This is what I can't understand.
It's perturbing the real thing.
Okay, but how can it do that? How can it initially have access to the real thing and then only later perturb it? You see?
I don't even understand the question.
Oh. Well, because
I mean, that's part of the problem when I think about vicarious causation. I don't even I mean, you know, I'm more than happy if we say that this right here in Deleuze and Guattari's famous example that they take from von Axel, right? This is a tick, right? And what is the tick responsive to? It's open to two kinds of information in the world, and only two, right? Heat on the one hand, and what is it, light? On the other hand, that's the only way in which it can be perturbed. And so there would have to be some sort of heat thing emanating from this other real object, or you know, some sort of light emanating from the other object for the tick to be perturbed in any particular way. It's you know, no entity for me is open to all of the possible sources of information that are available there in the universe around it, right? Like, I can't persuade this chair with speech.
okay, here's the problem I have with that. It sounds like you're saying, let me ask this question. Why would one thing perturb another? If a thing starts off able to directly access another, why does it perturb it? How can it perturb it? In other words, if the tick has direct access to the animal, how is it that it then perturbs it in terms of its limited number of capacities? It can't have direct access, right? Because the tick does not have access to you in the same way that a dog has access to you. They can't all initially have direct access to you, and then each of them, as an afterthought, perturbs
Well,
you.
I don't use the language of direct access at all. I just mean they're able to causally touch one another.
And that's direct access. That's direct access.
No. I mean, it's nothing like direct access in the way that you talk about it, that the tree would bear fruit inside of your head and everything like that. No, it's only a selective relationship to the world around it. You know, the tick is not like a mantis shrimp, for example, that's able to see ultraviolet light. It can't be perturbed in that way, and so for the mantis shrimp or for the tick, right? Patterns in flowers that exist for the mantis shrimp would not even be visible or accessible at all.
Okay, my point is that if the tick starts off with a selective relationship to an animal, then it's not making contact with that animal. Unless you want to give this theory that it's making direct but partial contact, which some people in the blogosphere try to do, and I don't think that works. The reason I don't think that works is because let's say you're shaking hands with somebody and say, oh, that's unproblematic. You're making direct but partial contact with the person. You're touching their hand, but not all of them. Well, but you're not even touching the whole hand, right? You're touching the epidermis of the hand. And then beyond that, you're touching something even more limited than the epidermis. And then the question becomes, let's say you're touching the epidermis of the person's hand. And what you're still saying is that you're using that epidermis as a mediator for making contact with the person. But then you still haven't explained how the epidermis communicates with the hand or with the nervous system. So direct but partial contact does not explain anything, is my point. That you cannot say, oh, it's not a problem for me to touch the person by shaking their hand. I know that I'm not touching their whole body. I know that I'm only touching one small surface of one part of their body. You still have to explain how that small surface indirectly allows you to communicate with the whole person, to make contact with them. Because you're not touching the whole person, obviously. You're touching part. But maybe we should do this at dinner.
Yeah. Can I just intercede here? I'd like to open out to more people on the floor if possible.
Yeah.
Jeremy?
Yeah, thank you very much. I have many questions, actually, so I will try to keep to three. So actually, there are more like three problems.